The call came in like any other missing persons report. A name, a location, a time last seen. That's usually how these things begin, quietly, almost unremarkably. But within hours, something shifted. The people trying to find Nancy Guthrie started noticing things that didn't sit right, details that didn't connect, a timeline that kept breaking apart the closer anyone looked at it. And the more questions they asked, the fewer answers came back. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses who could place her anywhere, no ransom note left behind, no proof of life, just a woman who had seemingly stepped out of the middle of her own life and disappeared so completely that the silence she left felt almost physical, like something you could press your hand against and feel pushing back. Most missing persons cases, no matter how painful, eventually find a shape. There's chaos at the beginning, then urgency. Then, somewhere in the middle of all that fear, a thread appears. Something investigators can follow toward at least a partial truth. The Nancy Guthrie case never gave them that thread. People who worked it would later say it was one of the more quietly disorienting cases they had encountered, not because of what they found, because of what they kept not finding. No ransom surfaced. No one claiming responsibility ever made contact. No exchange was ever arranged. And when Nancy Guthrie eventually came back, when she reappeared in the world, as if returning from somewhere only she knew, the questions didn't stop. They multiplied. What she brought back with her, and what she chose not to explain, left a gap that no investigation, no statement, and no official conclusion has ever fully closed. This is not a story about a clean resolution. It's a story about what happens when a disappearance refuses to follow the rules of one. To understand why this case became what it became, you have to first understand who Nancy Guthrie was before any of it started. Not who she became in the headlines, who she actually was in her daily life. To the people who knew her well enough to notice when something was wrong. She was not a public person, not someone whose name had ever appeared in news coverage, or whose life was lived in front of any kind of audience. By almost every account from the people around her, she was private, steady, someone who had built her life around routine and maintained it with a kind of quiet consistency that made her easy to take for granted in the best way. The kind of person you expect to be there because they always have been. Those who knew her described her as grounded, composed, not someone who made impulsive decisions or whose behavior ever veered into something unpredictable. She had a home. She had people who cared about her. She had a rhythm to her days that the people closest to her knew well enough to notice even small breaks in it. That rhythm, that reliability, it's part of what made what happened so hard to absorb. Because when someone unpredictable vanishes, the mind has places to go. It can reach for explanations without reaching too far. But when someone like Nancy Guthrie disappears, someone stable, grounded, with no apparent reason to be anywhere other than exactly where she was supposed to be, the silence lands differently. It lands harder. In the days leading up to her disappearance, according to those around her, there were no obvious signs that anything was wrong. No conflict that anyone knew about. No financial trouble that had broken into the open. No sense that she was frightened, or that she was watching for something, or quietly planning to go somewhere she hadn't told anyone about. She was simply present in her life. And then, without explanation, she wasn't. When the initial report was filed, the working assumption, the one that takes hold in the first critical hours of any missing persons case, was that something had happened to her against her will, that she had been taken, that someone, for some reason, had decided to remove her from her life by force. The word kidnapping entered the conversation early. It entered with weight, and once it was there, it started organizing everything around it, the way that word tends to do when fear is running the room. But assumptions, even the ones that feel most certain, have a way of costing you when you hold them too long. The early hours of a disappearance carry a very specific kind of tension. There's urgency, yes, but underneath it, there's also something that feels almost like denial, a quiet, stubborn hope that this is all a misunderstanding, that she forgot her phone somewhere, that she made a spontaneous decision and didn't think to tell anyone, that the explanation, when it arrives, will be so ordinary it will almost be embarrassing to have worried this much. That hope has a short lifespan. It rarely survives the moment investigators actually begin to look. What they found when they started examining Nancy Guthrie's life and surroundings was something that should have been reassuring but wasn't. Stability, order, a home that looked exactly as it should. Nothing broken, nothing visibly disturbed, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no signs of any kind of physical confrontation. Nothing that would tell the story of a struggle that had taken place and left its mark on the environment around it. In cases where someone is taken by force, the scene almost always speaks. The disorder becomes its own kind of evidence. It gives investigators a starting point, a physical reality they can document, trace, and build a timeline around. But when everything is undisturbed, when every object is exactly where it belongs, the investigation has nothing obvious to push against. It has to start from stillness, and starting from stillness is extraordinarily difficult. According to reports, investigators spent significant time in those early days simply trying to establish the basic shape of her absence. When had she last been seen? By whom? What was the last thing she did that anyone could confirm with certainty? These feel like simple questions. They are not. Each one, when followed carefully, seemed to open into another question rather than a clean answer. Each confirmed detail came with new uncertainty attached to the ones beside it. What slowly became apparent was that Nancy Guthrie's life, as steady and visible as it had appeared, had edges that were difficult to see, not because she had been concealing anything dramatic or living some parallel existence no one knew about, but because private people, almost by definition, leave fewer traces. They have fewer casual witnesses, fewer documented interactions, and fewer traces means fewer places for an investigation to begin. The word kidnapping was still doing its work. It was still holding the shape of the story together, still guiding where people looked and what they expected to find next. But quietly, without any single dramatic moment announcing it, the cracks were beginning to form. Kidnappings, particularly those driven by financial motivation, operate according to a fairly consistent logic. Someone disappears, then contact is made, demands follow, a timeline gets established, and somewhere in that process, almost always, comes proof of life, some form of evidence that the person being held is alive, and that returning them is still possible. That proof is not optional. It is the mechanism the entire exchange depends on. None of it came. What we're left with is not a mystery in the conventional sense. It isn't a puzzle with a solution waiting somewhere to be discovered. It's something quieter than that, and in some ways more difficult. It's the recognition that some events pass through public awareness with a days past, then more days. No phone call with demands, no contact with the family, no contact with investigators, no evidence that whoever might have taken her wanted anything in return. The silence that had surrounded her disappearance simply continued, unchanged, unexplained, and increasingly difficult to fit into a kidnapping framework. Investigators and analysts who work these cases have noted that the absence of contact is not a neutral fact. It is information. It shifts the weight of an inquiry in a specific direction. It raises questions, carefully, methodically, about whether the initial framing was accurate, or whether it had been allowed to become fixed before the evidence had actually earned that certainty. According to reports, those questions began surfacing both inside the investigation and in the broader conversations surrounding it. If she had been taken, where was the demand? If someone had her and wanted something, why hadn't they said so? And if no one seemed to want anything at all, then what was this exactly? The kidnapping narrative didn't fall apart in a single moment. It eroded, slowly, under the accumulated weight of everything it had promised and failed to produce. When the external story stops holding together, the investigation has no choice but to turn inward. Not because investigators are eager to look at the people who are grieving, but because the logic of elimination leads there eventually. Remove the explanations that don't fit, and what's left begins to point toward something closer, something more personal. This is where these cases stop being investigations and start being something harder to name, because the people who come into focus at this stage are often the same people who have been most visibly suffering. The family members who filed the report, the friends who haven't slept, The people who have been sitting next to their phones waiting for news that hasn't arrived. And now, by the nature of how investigations work, they become part of the story in a new and uncomfortable way. According to reports, the circle of inquiry in the Nancy Guthrie case widened in ways that created unease in those involved. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, exactly what responsible investigation requires when the straightforward explanation has failed to materialize. You return to the beginning. You look at everything again, but this time from a different angle, with different questions guiding you. What emerged from this phase wasn't a clear revelation. There was no moment where something broke open and a hidden truth poured out. What emerged instead was texture, complexity, a more layered picture of the relationships and circumstances that surrounded her life. Details that had seemed unremarkable earlier now carried a different kind of weight. Connections that had appeared ordinary now carried questions embedded inside them. No official conclusion was drawn at this stage, but the nature of what was being investigated had quietly, fundamentally shifted. It was no longer simply a search for a missing person. It had become something more difficult, an effort to understand why the version of events that had been offered at the beginning didn't quite match the reality that was slowly, carefully coming into view. And then Nancy Guthrie came back. That sentence is one that everyone involved had hoped to be able to say. In cases like this one, a return is what people pray for. It is the outcome that makes all the fear and the exhaustion and the sleepless nights feel, at least briefly, like they were worth it. She was alive. She was present. Whatever had happened, it had not ended the worst way it could have. But the relief didn't last in the way relief is supposed to. According to reports, the circumstances surrounding her return were not straightforward. The details of how she came back, where she said she had been, and what she could, or would, share about her time away did not resolve the questions. The investigation had spent days accumulating. In some respects, what she said, and what she didn't say, made those questions more insistent rather than less. Investigators who work missing persons cases have noted that a return under unclear circumstances is not simply a conclusion. It becomes its own form of evidence. What someone says when they come back, the gaps in what they say, what their physical state suggests about what they experienced, how the timeline of their return lines up, or doesn't line up, with what is already known. All of it gets examined. All of it gets held up against what came before. What made this particularly delicate was the emotional weight pressing against the investigation. From every direction, she was back. That mattered enormously. And yet the people responsible for understanding what had actually happened couldn't simply accept the surface outcome and move on. The investigation still had a responsibility to pursue what was true, not just what was convenient to believe. No official conclusion about the true nature of her disappearance was ever released in a form that provided the kind of clarity the case seemed to demand. What remained was a story with visible gaps that subsequent statements and accounts had not managed to close. What lingers about this case is not the disappearance itself. It's not the fear of those early days, or the investigation, or even the return. What lingers is the space between what was said and what was actually known. That quiet, persistent distance between the official account and whatever the full truth actually contains. Cases like this one challenge something fundamental in the way we process difficult events. We expect answers. We expect that when something this significant happens, and this many people are involved in trying to understand it, the pieces will eventually arrange themselves into something coherent. We expect that a return means a resolution. We expect the story to close. According to reports, questions have been raised and continue to be raised about the internal consistency of what was presented throughout this case, not as accusations, not as conclusions, as questions. The kind that arise when you look carefully at a sequence of events and keep finding places where things don't quite line up the way they should. What did Nancy Guthrie experience during the time she was away? What does she carry from those days that she has not shared and may never share? What do the people closest to her understand that has remained private? These are not questions meant to cause harm. They are questions the case itself created and then left open. The psychological weight of something like this does not lift cleanly when the person comes home. For the family, there's a complicated kind of relief. Grateful, yes, but tangled. For the investigators, there's the specific frustration of a case that never reached the closure it was supposed to reach. And for everyone who followed it, there's the slow, uncomfortable recognition that sometimes the story we're given is not the whole story. And sometimes we never receive the rest. There's something particular about stories that don't resolve. Finished stories, even the painful ones, eventually find a place to rest inside you. You process them. You file them somewhere. But unfinished stories don't rest. They stay open. They keep returning. The Nancy Guthrie case is that kind of story. A woman disappeared. The explanation offered, kidnapping, never gathered the evidence it would have needed to stand on. No ransom was confirmed. No proof of life was ever publicly verified. The investigation expanded, shifted directions, and ultimately arrived somewhere that satisfied very few of the people who had been watching it closely. And then she came back, which should have ended it, which did in single quotes t.ut, leaving behind the clarity that public awareness tends to assume it's owed. Nancy Guthrie is, above everything else, a person. Whatever the full truth of those days actually holds, it belongs first to her experience, to her life, to whatever she lived through that no outside account can fully reach. The details gathered by investigators, the questions raised, the gaps never closed. All of it orbits a human being whose interior experience of this story is something no report, no conclusion, and no documentary narration can completely access. That's worth holding onto. Even as we try to understand, the available facts raise legitimate questions. The collapse of the kidnapping narrative raises legitimate questions. The circumstances of her return raise legitimate questions. But questions are not verdicts. And the people at the center of stories like this one deserve, at minimum, to have that distinction honored, carefully, and without exception. What this case reflects, most of all, is how complicated disappearance can be as a human experience. People leave. Sometimes they are taken. Sometimes they choose to go. And sometimes the line between those two things is far less defined than we expect it to be. Sometimes the people involved, even long after it's over, are unable or unwilling to offer the explanation that would finally let the story rest. That doesn't make it less real. In a strange way, it makes it more honest about what real actually looks like. If this story stayed with you, you're not alone in that. Cases like this tend to follow people, not because of what was revealed, but because of what was left unrevealed. If something here moved you, or raised a question you wanted to sit with, or if you have a perspective that feels worth sharing, the comment section is there for exactly that kind of